One. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're receiving this information. My name is Rafael Vasquez Guzman. I am privileged to be a professor in the humanities and religious studies at Santa Rosa Junior College. And today we have the opportunity to talk with Professor Noel LaVoie, who is a psychology faculty at Santa Rosa Junior College. Thank you for taking the time and speaking with us. What we want to talk about is all of this stress that we all have as we move towards finals and how that affects our ability to concentrate and just get through this process. So, first of all, welcome and thank you for taking the time and being with us.
Yeah, happy to help. Nice to be here. Thanks for asking me, Raphael, and I hope I have something useful to offer all of your watchers.
Definitely. So, let's talk about this stress and how stress affects the body and the mind.
Okay, so in psychology, we talk about a stress or a stressor as being something that the person thinks exceeds their resources or ability to handle. So basically, when you decide that something is more than you can take, and that's going to vary from person to person, from situation to situation. For some people, it might be finals week. For other people, it might be a really difficult personal situation or the death of a loved one, or for some people, it might not seem like that much, but one of the things we know is that people's stress response is determined in large part by their life experiences. So one of the things that has a huge impact on how stress affects people are what we call adverse childhood experiences, or you might just think of them as trauma that you experience in childhood. In psychology, that means anywhere before 18, although the brain is still developing until our early 20s, so you might expect that people are a little more sensitive to those things too. So we know that if people have a lot of this kind of childhood trauma, it can make them more sensitive to stress. So feel free to interrupt with questions, okay?
Well, definitely. I mean, one of the things that I was going to mention is in my classes at the JC, I give my colleagues, as I call them, other people call them students, I give them the ACE test
Mm.
and familiarize them with it because when we talk about gangs and we talk about trauma, right, we end up giving that same test to the characters in the books that we read.
Mm.
And as a result of that, we're able to find out, well, these are not just criminals that did these horrible things. There are reasons that led to this trauma, and this is the only way that they knew how to cope. And often people don't understand this. So I appreciate that you're explaining this to us.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think everyone should know about ACEs. We now know that they're like one of the single biggest contributors to physical, mental health in your lifetime. And so for people who have more than 3 ACEs in their childhood, they have a much higher risk of really common health problems like cardiovascular disease or things like suicide risk or depression. So we worry about that. And why this happens, it's really just because when you're a child, you're more sensitive to stress. And this kind of repeated chronic stress in particular, it changes the way your brain handles things. It teaches your brain to always be prepared for more stress. And that the way I like to talk about it in class is that it's actually probably a very adaptive response if you're in an environment that has this kind of chronic stress, right? And it's way more important for you to be adapted to that than it is for you to be adapted to, say, a classroom environment, because one of these things is for your immediate survival. But being adapted to that kind of chronic stress environment, it can mean that you're less well adapted to other environments. So that's one big source of stress. And I think it really gives a great example of how stress impacts health. And it is such a big, big impact. Now, if we want to talk about maybe shorter term stressors or stressors that we have as adults, we can kind of loosely group those into 2 categories. We've got what they tend to call like major life stressors. And
Mhm.
there's scales for these too. And they're things like losing a loved one. That's kind of the biggest stressor on that scale. But even things like transferring colleges can be a pretty big stressor. Having to drop classes, that's a pretty big stressor. Um, having transportation problems like your car dies, having to switch a job or lose a job, divorce, lots of things are major life stressors. And we know that if people have 3 or more of these in a year, their risk of a physical health problem goes up quite a bit. It can double or even triple depending on how many of these they're juggling. But again, this is going to depend on the person and on what other things you've been through, right? So it's
Yeah,
not quite that neat.
exactly. And yet, as a society, we say, get over it. It's not a big deal, right? Like this society promotes the idea of individualism rather than collectivism. What's going on? Let me listen to your problem. I may not fully understand it because maybe I haven't gone through that experience. But I just sometimes just having somebody to talk with, it can be very, very beneficial. And so I really appreciate that you're giving us these examples because for somebody, it may not feel like a big deal that my car broke down this week, but now I have to decide if I'm going to stay in this class or not stay in this class. And, at work, they already warned me twice that I've been showing up late, and it was because of the car problems. And it just adds up and adds up. And so I appreciate that you're
Yeah.
taking the time and explaining it in such detail.
Yeah, absolutely. Stress is very much a cumulative problem, right?
Yeah.
And if we could all live a perfect stress-free life, we could handle when that one stressor popped up. But that's not my life. I don't know if that's anybody's life.
Hmm. Exactly.
The other interesting source of stressors, and this tends to get downplayed even more, are what we call daily hassles. So you might think about this as being stuck in traffic, having trouble finding a parking spot. Not that that ever happens on our campus.
Yeah.
Or, like interpersonal relationship problems, or maybe your professor's in a bad mood that day and takes it out on the class,
Yeah.
or there's an unexpected quiz or a due date changes, just things that are small, right? They don't register on like a major life stress scale. But the more of these you encounter in a day, the more stress you experience. And if that tends to happen a lot, and you might think about this as sometimes it's a measure of how much control you have over your own life, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes when you're younger or you have less privilege, you have less control. And so you might experience more of this kind of stress too. And it takes a toll, just like any other kind of stress.
Definitely. And then the other piece that I always like to mention, we talked briefly about the A's, and there are 10 questions that it asks. But
Mhm.
a couple of the questions that it doesn't mention there that I keep saying we need to create our own A's, issues of immigration, for example,
Oh,
or
yes.
racism, or maybe, gender discrimination. And as a result of that, there's additional factors that the ACE doesn't measure for, but maybe are part of your life. And those are just examples. I'm sure the ACE could be expanded over time, but these are our daily stressors, and we need to recognize that, right? And
Yeah.
so, living in a single parent household, and many other examples, but again, how do we begin to recognize those stressors is really, really important.
Yeah, this is a really good point. You don't see microaggressions often talked about as a type of daily hassle. They're clearly a source of like chronic stress that occurs in these little, death by a million paper cuts, or
Yeah,
right? I mean, these things
yeah,
happen all the time. And then you have the bigger stressors caused by things like racism and sexism. And of course, if you're in a group that also has intersectionality, you might have lots of sources of those. And there's a lot of research on this. We know that it's really strongly correlated with things like mental health and cardiovascular health. But you're right, they're not added to the ACEs. And another thing that's really interesting is we see the number of ACEs people experience varies dramatically by race, right? So these things are really interwoven. And you can see some of this is really caused by our society,
Mhm.
and the amount of privilege that people do and don't have is a big factor. Yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
absolutely.
So being able to recognize that as a first step towards what do I do about it. And I know that you have some examples beyond the basics in regards to if you take the A's and it starts making sense that some of the possible consequences could be your health, such as
Mhm.
suffering from obesity or COPD, the inability to breathe properly. Or then you start taking dangerous decisions, right? That joining a gang as one of those things where you're looking for love, affection, respect with a crowd that themselves, many of them have suffered from a lot of discrimination or trauma. Those are items that are important. Could you give us some other examples as to how can we notice the consequences of stress?
Yeah, so good question. So it shows up in so many different ways. So one question I sometimes get in class is, but does it really affect my body? And I can say, oh yes, very much. They've done these sort of strange experiments on dental students where they actually make a puncture in the roof of their mouth, and they'll compare what happens in terms of how quickly this heals if they do it in the summer compared to if they do it during finals week. And the bad news as we go into finals week is that it takes about 3 days longer for the student's body to heal during
Mhm.
finals week. They also find that it takes longer if a student is currently depressed. So keep in mind that the way that you're feeling when a stressor occurs can also make it, affect your body more than it might otherwise. So when, we talk about stress to a certain extent, it's learned, it's based on experience. The reaction varies so much from person to person, but also there are things that are going to stress everybody out, right?
Mhm.
So, okay, some of the other things that happen, well, I think a lot of students notice that it can be really hard to focus, that attention and memory, decision making, planning, all of these like executive functions, cognitive functions, they do not work that well. And part of this is because stress sometimes manifests as anxiety, or we call it rumination, where you've got like these, you might think about it as your brain is already occupied by thinking about the stressors. And the more of them there are, the more occupied it gets.
Yeah.
And now what's left to actually do your work and live your life is not enough. And so we notice like really big declines in this kind of cognitive function when people are stressed. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I hear frequently around the end of the semester is sometimes students will say, you know, I got to the parking lot and I don't even remember how I got to the parking lot, right?
Mhm.
Their mind is so focused on so many other things that certain things are just being done automatic, which
Yeah.
in a way could be dangerous because there may be, right, you may still be following the same path to get to your destination, but there may be other factors that could cause car accident. And so it's important to notice how the brain is affected by stress in general, but that
Yeah.
there's not a single way that people react to it. And it's important for people to pay attention to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Honor your own experiences when it comes to stress. If
Mhm.
you're feeling stressed, trust that you are and do what you can to cope with it. It's worth it in the long run. It really saves your body and your brain, your mind, everything. Yeah.
So, assuming we are listening to this information today and we recognize, yes, I've been dealing with this. I know that I have 3 finals. I know how I have that 10-page essay I have to write. Um, and then I have work and family is chaotic or whatever the situation may be. What are some of the ways that people can cope better in order to be able to have a successful end of the semester?
Okay. So there are like some standard things that psychologists recommend, but I like to really acknowledge that everyone's life is a little bit unique. And one of the things we do in my classes is we share our tips for coping with strategies. I say our students share their tips
Mhm.
for coping with stress. And because they tend to have more similarities and more lifestyle things in common, I think these are probably more useful. So why don't we start with the things my students say they've been using for the
Mhm.
last few years to really manage stress in a way that works for them. And just, these won't work for everybody, but here's a short list of things you can try. So number one, self-care. That does not mean pedicures and massages. That means sleeping, eating, and exercise. And so students say that one thing they do that sometimes can help with this is to try to stick to a really fixed routine so that they have a bedtime and they eat meals at like fixed times so that they don't
Mhm.
forget to eat and they don't end up staying up too late and then being really tired the next day. And so sleeping and eating can really help your body to cope with the stress a bit better. And it sounds really basic, but I think we all know that when we're stressed, these things are actually quite difficult to do.
Mhm. Definitely.
Some of the other things they like to do, spending time in nature. I think we have a lot of good options for that around here.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of research that shows that this really does kind of help with some of the physical responses to stress. So it'll help to lower blood pressure, just for example. And it does seem to help people cope overall with stress a bit better. So in areas where you have like nature deserts, just areas where people can't easily access nature, you see higher rates of certain diseases that are related to stress. So it's not super conclusive, but it might be helpful.
And
Um,
this is where gardening may be of use for some individuals, just literally getting your hands in the dirt and moving it around and weeding your backyard if you're privileged enough to have something like that. If you have a few pots with different plants, again, this is what is my understanding. The research suggests just getting your hands in the dirt gets you a little bit more motivated, if nothing else, and it allows some of the stress to just disappear.
Yeah, I will admit that at my house, gardening is a big stress relieving pastime.
Yeah.
My husband likes to refer to it as his cheap therapy.
Yeah.
So there you go. And the research says that even just if you can go out and find some trees and some grass,
Mhm.
or go to the beach, or just be outside in a more natural setting with less man-made stuff and less of that kind of noise and stimulus, that can help, I don't know, kind of reset a little bit.
Mhm.
Helping other people. So one of the reasons that this probably helps with coping is that helping other people tends to give our mood a boost. So it's kind of a selfish reason to help other people, but it for sure works. And lots of research like positive psychology and happiness research shows that helping other people can, um, you know, make you feel good. So it's a good option. Um, Limiting certain kinds of media. So if you find that you're a doom scroller or that are going down rabbit holes on the internet or exposing yourself to a lot of news media, things that tend to be more negative and can increase stress, maybe avoid those. A lot of students say that they make a lot of lists as they get more overwhelmed and busier, and especially if they're trying to juggle work and school, that making to-do lists, and something that's sometimes recommended is being a bit ruthless about this and taking off anything that's not absolutely necessary.
Mhm.
Um, Another really big one is communicating with friends and family about how you're feeling. So you're feeling stressed, and sometimes it's natural to just want to avoid people. And really, the opposite is going to be more helpful if you have people that you feel supported by normally. Reaching out to them and just saying, hey, I'm stressed. It's finals week. It's, a lot is going on. And then it gives your support network like a chance to actually support you. And that can be helpful. They can maybe reach out to you in ways that feel low pressure, but still let you know that they're, there for you. So,
And one of the things that I've noticed with that, with some of my colleagues, students, is that by sharing with each other, oh, I have this upcoming deadline and I have to write this paper, and they know that maybe this person is starting to spend too much time scrolling through Instagram or other social media, that text message or that phone call that says, "Hey, how's that paper coming up?" Right? So that support group, or do you want to get together? I'll do my homework over here. You do your homework on the other side of the table, and it's like it can work similarly as going to the gym, right? Many people at the beginning of the year buy a whole year's membership to the gym, and then after 2 3 weeks they don't go anymore, but there is a higher likelihood that they'll continue to go to the gym and be healthier if they have that buddy that they go to the gym with. So holding each other accountable in a loving, respectful way.
I absolutely agree. In fact, I teach statistics, and at the beginning of the semester, I encourage everyone to make a few friends in class,
Mm.
more for moral support than
Yep.
anything else, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just helpful to have a friend when you're going through anything.
Yeah, definitely.
A lot of my students say that they find playing video games relaxing. It's actually really interesting. The Army's done some research with veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder that found that playing kind of repetitive video games like Tetris is
Hmm.
one they've especially studied, can help to lower their stress response, at least temporarily. So I'm not sure if every video game is going to have equal benefit, but I also know for some of the students, they talk about it in terms of it's got, the benefit of social interaction. It's got the benefit of really distracting them from what other problems they're doing. So something to consider. It's not necessarily on the traditional list of things that psychologists recommend, but I want to say enough students recommend this that it's something to consider. And then students also talk about things like taking baths or listening to music or things that kind of stimulate some of their other senses. And
Hmm.
that can help create some balance too. You know, we can kind of get into spirals when we're stressed and feeling anxious or worried about things. And just getting in touch with some of your other senses can really help with that. So I think also this connects to your example, Raphael, of, gardening or touching
Hmm.
some soil and just kind of getting grounded by that. So,
Yeah, one of the things that I know a lot of, or at least in the Latinx community, a lot of what we practice is drinking tea.
mhm.
Chamomile tea is a very calming tea, without sugar for sure, but it's a very calming tea. And connecting it to the cell phone and scrolling, I always tell when I do workshops about some of this stuff, I always say, put your cell phone away half hour before bed and sip on some of that tea as you're getting ready. It'll help you calm down and relax. And you and I, before we started recording, we were talking about a couple other products that people can use, natural herbs like rosemary tea, or lavender is another one. I always say to people, if you can afford it, just put it in a clean sock and put it in your pillowcase, and then you'll naturally relax much better and be able to fall asleep as you are heading towards the end of your evening.
Yeah, sometimes we can take advantage of the fact that our brains learn from everything we do to create habits that can
Mhm.
support some of this too, right? So using lavender as a cue that it's time for bed, that might help you fall asleep even when you're stressed because you have these extra learned cues you've got there too. So in
Yeah,
addition to engaging your senses and helping you, you know, get outside of what's in your mind, right?
definitely. Yeah,
Sometimes we all need to escape that, I think.
exactly. And I think that students also should understand that we as faculty, we also end up with, sometimes hundreds of pages at the end of the semester, or tests that we have to review and grade. So for me, again, chamomile tea is a really good friend. And just a reminder, and there's studies about this in regards to rosemary. If you have rosemary tea, or you have a rosemary plant that just fills your room or your space with that smell, it's really good for memory And then what I tell them is bring a little bit of it to class, smell it again. When it's time to take the test, it will relax you. And a lot of what you studied the day before or a few days before, it'll just naturally come to you. And this is nature helping us be successful in life.
And now can I make one more plug here?
Of
Because I
course.
think one of the things I've been trying to encourage my students to do is when it gets to this point where they're starting to feel stressed and maybe they've had some personal problems or work problems come up. And this is the part of the semester where my students start to contact me and they're getting worried they're falling behind because of these different pressures. And I've got a pretty flexible late policy, and I always encourage my students to let me know and to ask if they need more time. And I just want to say, this is one thing sometimes students forget is that they're allowed to ask. And
Yeah.
maybe not every instructor is going to say, oh, sure, take as much as time as you need. But many of us are understanding and would be happy to help. And so I just want to say, sometimes there are like really concrete things that I can do to help a student. And I'm happy to do that, even if it's just, hey, yes, take an extra week or come to office hours and I'll hold your hand through this difficult homework. That's fine. It's part of what we're here for, right?
Yes, definitely. Self advocacy is part of this. When we are so stressed, sometimes we convince ourselves, no, the member is not going to understand my situation. No, they're probably going to require documentation that I had this unique situation. Whatever the situation is, it's better to advocate. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but it's better to advocate. And again, the other piece is not wait until the last day of the semester to say, oops, I should have, right? I always tell individuals from day one of the semester, go to office hours, introduce yourself. And now, if you're having a hard time, you go back and you say, hey, I'm the student that visits you for office hours every couple of weeks. I'm having a hard time with this. Is there a way that you can work with me to make up this work or get an extension on this, whatever the situation is? And as you said, not every faculty is going to do it, but most faculty understand that as human beings, we have challenges every day. And again, it goes back to the point of stress that sometimes there's no documentation, right? In my class, in my in person class, um, my colleagues, as I call them, they all have one mental health day, which means if you miss one day in the semester and you didn't show up, I don't need an explanation. You just come up to me and you just say, that was my mental health day. As long as it's not during a quiz or a midterm, right? We'll work on those. But as long as it's not, you don't need to explain to me why you were absent. If you want to let me know, that's perfectly fine. But other than that, you can just write me a little note, drop it on my desk, and say, can you count this as my mental health day? And that's it. And then they can be relaxed and understand that we all get opportunities, because at least in my situation, I wouldn't be in the privileged position I am in as a faculty member if I didn't have the right support from the right people. I had many difficulties, but I did have supportive individuals who were there for me. And I think that it falls on us to be those supportive individuals as well.
Yes, absolutely. I love to see that. And I have to confess, I've been giving all of my exams on Canvas untimed now for a couple of years. Started it during the pandemic,
Mm.
and students report that that's lowered their stress dramatically because of how many of our students suffer from test anxiety.
Yeah,
But also that gets worse at the end of the semester
yeah,
with the other stressors, and it all kind of just compounds, right? So
definitely.
also a shout out to our colleagues at Disability Resources. It's never too late to reach out to them. It might take a week or two to get in, but they will help you advocate with any instructors that aren't meeting your needs. And that can be huge. And I don't know, how long do you think the wait list is at Student Mental Health Services, Raphael? But it might not be too late for that either. So
Definitely. And what I tell our colleagues all the time at student health services is, or mental health services is, right, if we can create group conversations in my nonprofit Humanidad Therapy and Education Services, we call it convivencias, which is basically a group conversation that would be very helpful. On Tuesdays, you could have a group conversation about maybe something about homework, and then you invite people to come back on Thursdays and some other challenge that people are dealing with, and then you can have 10 and 12 people rather than doing that 10 times or 12 times because you're doing a one-on-one. So I hope that they are understanding and really create this type of support groups, so that individuals can succeed. And there was just a piece of study, I believe, that came out just today that says that now in the United States, we're seeing a higher number of people diagnosed with adult ADD and ADHD.
Mhm.
And so if you are somebody who's having a difficult time concentrating and you cannot sit still, and you could tell us some of the features of that, please go to student psychological services, student health services, or DRD, and somebody will start the paperwork to be able to, if need be, diagnose you and determine what is the best support for you.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. Um, could you remind us as we come to the end of this conversation, could you remind us what department you work at and what classes do you typically teach at Santa Rosa Junior
Oh,
College?
sure. So I'm in the behavioral sciences department. I'm on the Santa Rosa campus, but I teach classes both online and in person. And I teach the psychology of prejudice and discrimination, Psych 34. I teach Introduction to Psychology, Psych 1A. I teach research methods, Psych 1B, and I teach statistics, Psych 9. I also sometimes teach our cognitive psychology class, which is Psychology 11. So, yeah,
Good.
love to see some students in class.
Definitely. And again, my name is Rafael Vasquez Guzman. I teach in the Humanities and Religious Studies department, but I teach Humanities 6, which is my gang class. And we look at gangs from the multiple areas of view, from psychology, philosophy, the criminal justice system, and much, much more. And I also teach popular culture in the United States. So we talk about, again, how social media affects our stress levels and much, much more. And then I also teach my Latin America and the Caribbean class, where we talk about anything and everything from slavery to how do we um, remember what we've been forced to forget. And so, with that, I want to thank my colleague, Noel LaVoie, who had the opportunity, or I had the opportunity to interview you here, so that we could provide a little bit of information to students so that they can best prepare for finals. So thank you for taking the time and being with me today.
Yes, thank you, Raphael. Appreciate it.